name is Pralie Dutzel. The hardest part about this is my name is weird and it's going to be hard to spell, so I'll have a link to my Twitter at the end as well as my slides in case you want to look up everything. And you might notice I'm a Windows user. I'm the weird person here. I come from a game development background, so Windows is my preferred shop. Nothing against Mac. Work with it as well at work. And I work for a company called Big Yam, the Parsons agency. We're actually here in town. We work up in North Scottsdale. It's an advertising agency where we work on a lot of client websites. My role is lead front-end developer there. So I handle a lot of the front-end development, obviously, and working with our design team to build responsive experiences for our clients. So today I'm here to talk to you about the in-betweeners of responsive design. And I've already had a couple people like, what does that mean? So we'll get into that. Responsive design has been around for a little while now. The term was first coined by Ethan Marcotte in an article for Elicipart in 2010. So it's been a pretty great 6-ish years so far, however you want to define that. But we're often still trying to cram our websites into these buckets. Things like desktop and mobile, and hopefully you're also considering tablet. But responsive design is a lot more than that. If we're thinking of it as buckets, think of it as a bunch of buckets everywhere and they've been knocked over and there's just water all over the place. That's kind of what responsive design is. We now have things like smartwatches. And for any other gamers, we have browsers on game consoles. And there's the Internet of Things, where we're sticking internet and browsers onto devices like refrigerators and vacuum cleaners and smart homes. Even the devices that we know and love today are constantly changing. We get new sizes every year. Samsung comes out with, you don't even want to think about how many different sizes of devices. It's a huge range. And a lot of tablets today are the same size, same resolution as smaller desktop screens. Responsive design is not about fitting a website onto these specific devices. Stop thinking of it as mobile and tablet and desktop. And these aren't separate experiences. The point is to kind of marry these things together. So focus on building one fluid experience that works at any size. And remember, content's kind of the point of these applications and websites that we're building. And this is going to let your content shine. So you might be like, okay, yeah, I get it. I've been doing responsive design. But how am I supposed to make something responsive with all these potential points of failure? And I'll admit, this is a tough job. There's a lot to think of here. But one of the things we can do is to start small, and build up from there. And you probably know this is mobile first. And this is really where we can give ourselves some constraints, where we can start thinking of how can we get our content to work on these small, these weird sized devices, and then build up from there. This applies to both designers and developers. This isn't like just one person is going to handle all of this. It's important that we work together on this. If you're a designer, this is going to help you showcase your content, and then as you gain more room in larger displays, then you can start to actually build that fancy, flashy homepage instead of starting with that and trying to cram your site onto like a smartwatch. We know that doesn't really work very well. So start with the constraints and then work your way up. And you can always keep adding enhancements the more features are available and the more screen real estate. And if you're a developer, focus on writing semantic markup and set your base styles to mobile. This is a pretty common thing that we're doing, but semantic markup is especially important. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but it's going to force you to think about the structure of your document and hopefully declutter some of your CSS when you're starting with the base as simple mobile, and then you can enhance from there. So it takes a village to make a responsive experience. It's the unison of design and development. We can't really do one without the other. So it's important to work together for effective, responsive experiences. Teamwork makes the dream work. I love corgis, so feel free to spam me with corgi pictures. Go and talk to your teammates if you're not the sole person building something. Talk to your designers. If you're a designer, talk to your development team. And just kind of figure out patterns, workflows, things that work for your team, because a little bit of it is dependent on your own team and your communication styles and things like that. But it's important to get the conversation started if you haven't already. So let's go ahead and start digging into our tool set. And am I going too fast? Let me know. Good, okay. So we know that media queries are the building blocks of responsive design. It's something, you know, it's what we've been using them for, but they often fall victim to our first point on kind of pigeonholing ourselves into these specific device sizes. So here we have an example. Hopefully you guys can see that all right. It's pretty standard, all right, we've got some media queries going up from there. But if it doesn't look familiar, how about now? These are specific to the iPhone 5 and iPad. So in this case, we're defining our breakpoints for our website based on specific devices. And that doesn't really work that great. It'll work great for those devices. But what about all those weird Android devices or all those things in between? So these are tied to specific devices, and while they can be a great starting point and you might actually use breakpoints like that, they're not quite enough. They're not going to scale that great. This is a great picture by Brad Frost, just highlighting a sort of device lab, a bunch of different devices he has. And obviously this is only a small snippet of everything that's available out there. But it's a good kind of image to look at and remember, that's a lot to support. So when we're setting up our breakpoints, it's important to let your content dictate your breakpoints. Look for those areas where your content starts to look a little bit funny and add a breakpoint from there. I like to do this with what I call the resize until it breaks test. That's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just walk through it pretty quickly. So we're gonna start small. We're building mobile first. We have our wonderful layout, whatever it may be. And we'll just slowly start to resize the browser until something doesn't quite look right. And when you're doing this, I recommend focusing on one section of your site or a specific pattern. That way you don't get overwhelmed trying to fix everything. And once it breaks, you have a problem area, you can start to add a breakpoint and make those small adjustments. And you can repeat for happy little layouts. So this is great. It takes care of a lot of the bigger layout issues in areas where your content starts to break down. But device labs are also great. If you're doing any responsive design, I highly recommend trying to get your hands on as many devices as you can, because each OS, device, browser, they all have their own little quirks and issues. So if you can get your hands on real devices, it'll help kind of identify and allow you to fix those quirks. But the resize until it breaks test is also a great way to handle a lot of those in-between states. So the downside of this is that there are lots and lots of breakpoints to this. This can make it a little difficult to maintain and modularize, and if you're working on a larger team, they might be like, why are you adding 1441 pixel breakpoint here? That's a little weird. So I like to look for patterns and trends in those breakpoints and try to adjust things as needed, see where I can kind of group things that are related and go from there. So my preferred approach, like I said, is to define variables based on common breakpoints, things that are actually related and are good with breaking at the same time. So there's an example there. And then for those in-between states that are specific to a specific pattern and its context, I'll go ahead and create a custom value for that. And before I go there, one thing I also recommend doing is if you're adding a bunch of these, it can help to add like a one-liner of like your reasoning behind it, just a comment of saying like, font size needs adjusted, too large for these screens, or just too large at this size. Just to give your team a little bit more context of if they go back and make edits, okay, why is this random number here? Okay, I can see that, that makes sense. And right now, we're relying a lot on our viewport. That's where all our media queries take place. But this is going to get better once we start getting container queries. Has anybody heard of container queries in here? Raise your hand. A couple of you guys, cool. The idea behind container queries, I'm not going to get really into it because that's a whole talk of its own, is that you're going to resize and make adjustments based on the size of the parent container versus the viewport. So it'll give you a lot more control over things like media queries specific to elements and patterns. They are a work in progress though, so they're not really readily available, but I encourage you to look them up and hopefully we'll get them soon. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of where we can create content-centric breakpoints with something that's pretty common on the web. It's a media object pattern. If you aren't familiar with media objects, you've probably seen them all over. It's just usually some sort of media, whether it's an image or a video, and then associated content like a headline, a description, and maybe like a read more link, something like that. Since we're starting mobile first, we're going to go ahead and set this up in just a simple stacking order. So the image or video will be on its own line, followed by its associated content. As we get a little more space, we can go ahead and fit the image next to its associated content. And this is probably a little more familiar for what you're used to seeing. We can build this really quickly with Flexbox. So this is our markup for that. It's pretty straightforward. Can you guys see that all right? Good. We're starting with a wrapping element. And in this case, I've made it an article. You could do a list item, an anchor tag, a div if you really want, whatever works best for your context. Within there, I have two wrapping divs, one for the image and one for the content. Now, you might be wondering why the image is in another div. It kind of seems like div soup. That's actually a fix for Flexbox. There's a bug in IE where if you have an image on its own inside a Flex container, it's going to stretch your image and look really ridiculous. So just surrounding it in a div will fix that problem. And this is our CSS. That's all we need to do all of that work we just talked about. So we're going to go ahead and add display flex to our wrapping element. And then the default is to not wrap. We want that stacking context, so we're going to allow it to wrap. And after that, we're going to go ahead and just add a little bit of margin, and that's going to just give it that little bit of spacing there. And then the last item is to add flex 1 to our content. Flex 1 is a shorthand property. If you're not familiar with Flexbox, it's shorthand for flex grow, shrink, and basis. And what 1 is doing is basically telling it it can grow, it can shrink, however this much space is available, it'll adjust itself as needed. So that'll give us exactly what we look for, so we'll start that mobile first. And then as we resize the browser, we'll get exactly what we wanted. And we didn't use a single media query. That's pretty cool, right? Even though I was just talking about media queries, it seems kind of silly, I guess. So you might be wondering, is Flexbox actually just magic? It kind of is, yes. I love Flexbox. But while it's handling a lot of the heavy lifting, it's not really a perfect solution. It's not going to handle those in-between areas. So let's look at an example of that same pattern. So this is at a weird resolution where Flexbox says, well, I'm not ready to start wrapping yet. But it doesn't really look that great, does it? Everything's kind of squished and weird looking. And this is what we call the sevens pattern. So the content gets squished, becomes difficult to read. Granted, it would probably be a lot easier to read if there wasn't a giant red 7 on it. And there's also this weird space below the image. If you had a CTA or a read more button at the end of that content, it would start to get disconnected from the image and just kind of, it's not great looking, right? This is an opportunity to introduce a new breakpoint and really finesse that pattern. So we're gonna let Flexbox handle the heavy lifting and then go ahead and finesse where necessary. So we could do things like maybe shrink the image a little bit so it's not quite as large depending on the resolution or where you see fit. That's still not great though, so maybe we could reduce the font sizes overall. That looks a little bit better, right? The little tweaks you make are what matter. No one's gonna notice when you tweak things like this, except maybe your developer friends. But when you don't do it, they will. And they might bounce from your site or not, they might not keep reading. Whatever it is, they might just, that doesn't look great, and leave. I know I've done it. So these little tweaks you make really matter. And it's what sets good responsive design apart. We've talked, some of the other speakers have talked about the attention to detail in whether it's an animation or your patterns. It also applies to responsive design. So let's move on to grid systems. This is another area where we can make those little tweaks that hopefully are going to really enhance the experience across all device sizes. I'll start off by saying that you do not need a framework to use a grid system. It's pretty easy to roll your own, and things like Bootstrap or Foundation, while they're great, they might not have all of the control and you might have to override a lot of things. So we're just going to set up a simple grid system. Nothing too fancy. I'm going to omit a couple of extra things like grid, excuse me, not the grid. Well, we want that. The gutters, just so I can show you a couple cool things we can do. So we're going to start off mobile first. So we'll just go ahead and make our grid items 100% wide. Nothing crazy here. Then we'll go ahead and do our resize until it breaks test. As we resize the browser, we'll find the point with maybe the content or the image is looking a little crazy. Maybe your image is gigantic now. So we'll go ahead and define a new breakpoint, and we're going to set the width to 50%. For this example, I'm going to use a floated grid just so I can show you some cool stuff we can do. But because we're floating, we're going to need to clear each row. If you're familiar with Bootstrap, this is usually the way you'd handle it, by wrapping your columns in your rows, excuse me, in another div with the class of row. But this isn't really great. Not only are you adding additional markup, but you're also letting your markup define your presentation. And once you resize to another point where maybe you want to go ahead and add another breakpoint and increase the number of columns, then suddenly the row class doesn't really apply to all the same things. This is where the nth child selector is going to come in. This is probably one of my favorite things. I use it all the time. Do I have any other nth child fans in here? Yeah. So if you're unfamiliar with this, this is something that essentially lets you select specific elements. So the in acts as a counter. It starts at 0 and increments by 1 each time. So this is going to let you select specific elements. If we go back to our grid example, Since we have 2 columns here, we're going to want to clear each row. Hopefully you are not going to use a div with a class of row, because we could do it with just CSS. So in this example, we have just 2 columns to clear every row. We can use int child 2in plus 1. So that might be like, what does that mean? It's a little weird. So if we just do a simple math, we can do 2 times 0, 0 plus 1. That just gives us 1. So that clears that first row at the top there. That's in case you have anything extra above that might be floated. And for a second row, we can increment in by 1. So 2 times 1 plus 1. And so now we have 3, that clears that row, and so on and so forth. You can add as many rows, as many grid items as you want, and it'll just keep adding the math. So we're going to go back to resizing our browser, get to a point where things don't look that great, and maybe now we want 3 columns. So we'll go ahead and create a new breakpoint and add a new width property for that. But because of the code that we wrote for our 2-column grid, even though we have defined 3 columns, we're only seeing 2 because the clears we've added are just going to break down our layout. So this is a pretty easy fix. All we have to do is reduce the scope of our previous clearing element there. So we're just going to add a max width for whatever our new breakpoint is, and then we can encapsulate that so that it won't affect further breakpoints that we add in the larger screens. So now that we have our 3-column grid looking correct, we're going to go ahead and want to clear each row, just like we did the last time. This time we're just going to use 3in plus 1. It's, again, just doing the same math. So this will give us clear every row for a 3-column grid. And we can keep doing this for as large of a display as we want. And you can keep adding, say you have a lot of columns and you really want to have like 7-column grids on a really large display. You can keep adding this and just make sure you encapsulate each one so that it doesn't affect the next breakpoint. And this allows us to make a little bit better use of any space as we get larger, because although we might be thinking mobile first, there's also these huge desktops out there. We can't forget about those as well. So media queries and nth child allow us to create these robust grid systems pretty quickly. So let's kind of look at some other cool things that we can do with nth child. So let's say you wanted to create a visual hierarchy. Let's just say we have a 3-column grid, pretty standard, but maybe the first item is like a featured post or something. Maybe you want to call special attention to just that one. So all we have to do is define in our CSS width of 100% for first child, and maybe you want to make the font size a little bit larger in that case as well, to really call attention to that specific item. And first child is kind of a spin-off of nth child. There are a lot of these. There's nth child, nth of type, which is a little bit different. First child, last child. You can do all kinds of pretty cool stuff with just this one selector and its kind of spin-offs. So continuing on the visual hierarchy, we can go ahead and maybe our second and third items are a little more important than all the other ones too, but not quite as important as the featured post. So we can just create a ranged selector. And I'm going to walk through this one because it's a little bit weird. So we're going to go ahead and use nth child in plus 2. And all this is going to do is target every single item starting with the second one. Because if you add 0 plus 2 is 2, and then it just goes on from there. So that takes care of, we're targeting 2 and 3 now, but we're targeting a lot more than what we really want. Then we also have nth child negative in plus 3. You can put some pretty crazy values in here, negative numbers included. So what this does is it's going to target all grid items, counting backwards from the third. So negative 0 is 0 plus 3 is the third item. Then we have negative 1 plus 3 is the second, and then 1, and there's no more beyond that. So that'll cover just those ones. And then we can combine those two, and now we can target only the second and third because they're the only two that apply in both cases. And this is allowing us to limit our range and select specific items. And you can do all kinds of stuff with this, manipulate different layout patterns and things, however, whatever works for your context. But it's just kind of a fun, even just experimenting with this, you can do some pretty cool things. You can also do things like fill the remaining grid space. So if we look at our 3-column grid, maybe we don't have a perfectly even number of items, which is probably going to happen if your client is updating content and things like that. So it might look a little bit funky, uneven. We can do something to add in an extra kind of dummy block. Maybe it's a CTA to learn more about our company, or just a presentational image, or maybe even a solid color just to kind of help fill that space and give it a little bit more balance. In this case, we can do that by targeting the last child, and then we can chain off of that. Here we have nth child 3n plus 2. And that might seem a little bit funky, but all we're doing is checking, does that fall into the second column? That's all we really care about. Is it the last item, and does it fall into the second column? If yes, give it a width of 50%, since we know it's 3 columns, to fill the remaining space. We can add another line to that as well, and this one is if it's the only item on its own row, just to kind of stretch it out and fill that whole space out. So you don't have just a weird dummy, because with this now we would have a weird dummy item in just 1 or 2 columns, but this will help stretch it out. So again, we'll check for last child, and then 3n plus 1, we'll just check to see, is it in that first column? If it is, 100%. We'll make it as wide as we want to really drive home that CTA. I feel like I probably went through that a little fast. Nth child can be a little confusing. I say it first here, but it's still confusing to me sometimes too. So you're not alone if you're like, what on earth is that math? Here are 2 of my favorite resources. There's an excellent write-up on CSS tricks with some useful nth child recipes. And then nthTest.com is this great website that lets you plug in numbers, and then you can see visually which grid items or which items it's going to work with. So I highly recommend playing around with nth child. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with it and create some really unique layouts. And the nth child selector is actually part of CSS 3. It's been widely supported for a while. We've got lots of green there, which you don't see a lot these days. So you could definitely use it in production. There's no question about that. There are a couple of bugs I'm not going to get into here. If you want to go to caniuse.com, I think it is, and you can check on the known issues tab depending on if you're supporting really old versions of OSs and browsers. So like I said, both of these are media queries and nth child. They're well supported. So we can leverage these existing tools to make a little bit better responsive experiences. And that's not just for mobile, that's not just for desktop. Just kind of tweak and have it across the board. And then you can further enhance things with Flexbox and hopefully soon CSS grid layout and container queries. So if you leave with nothing else from this talk, I hope that you will remember that responsive design covers a lot more than just screens and devices. It's much more than mobile and desktop or even tablet. There's all kinds of crazy stuff like smartwatches and the Internet of Things, game consoles. But it also extends to a few other areas I want to talk about. One of those being print styles. You might be like, what? What does this have to do with responsive design? And I will be the first to admit that for a long time I kind of just stopped writing print styles. I was like, nobody prints websites anymore. Who does that? And so I had an older coworker come up to me, and she wanted to proofread something and asked about printing it out. She printed it out, and the navigation was overlaid up top the whole page, and she couldn't read anything because we didn't take that little bit of extra time to just go in and say display none for print. It's not that difficult to do. I'll have a couple resources on my site at the end. But it's one of those little things. It's still part of the experience overall. Even if you're not going to print it, maybe it's something like a confirmation page. There was a tweet that went out a while ago about Indiegogo's confirmation page. You couldn't print it. And if you needed that for your records, well, too bad. So just take a little bit of extra time. Print styles are pretty easy. You usually just display none most of your other stuff except for the content that you need. And then also screen readers. This is a whole other audience that's using assistive technology to view your website and view your content. They want to access that. And they're not going to be able to if you're hindering them without writing semantic markup. If you're putting things to block them from viewing your site, you're discounting an entire audience from that. So write semantic markup. There's lots of great, there's been a big push for this recently, it seems like, in our community. So there's been a lot of great tutorials and articles writing up specific information on this. If you look up just like any of the Alley resources, that'll be a great starting point. But just, this is another extension of responsive design. Thinking of your audience as a whole, no matter what device, whatever they're trying to view your content on, this is how they can access it. And that's not to mention all the crazy stuff we're gonna get in the future. We're starting to look at VR on the uprise, and who knows what else is gonna come out of this. So if we start thinking about those tweaks now and making that little bit of extra effort, then we can kind of start to gain more traction and get ready for that future tech, even if we don't know what it's gonna be like yet. So I know, this is a lot to consider. This is a ton of stuff. But no one ever said our job was easy. And there's a lot of stuff that's coming out that's gonna help us, like container queries and things like that. And so as things come out, it'll get a little bit easier, but also on the flip side, we'll have more devices and things coming out as well. So there's still a long road ahead of us. But if you use the right tools and some dedication and working together with designers and developers, we can all work towards building better experiences on the web overall. And I have a link to my slides and resources there. And all right, well, that went pretty quick. Thank you guys for having me.